Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. In our last program, we talked about building efficient infrastructure. I'm Ray Charmonti, your host for Beyond Today and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. We will be talking today with two guests about how to create or recreate thriving neighborhoods. Our guests are James Moore of the School of Architecture at the University of South Florida and Kacy Curry, a resident of Seminole Heights and also the Vice President of the Old Seminole Heights Civic Association. She is also a consultant with Wade Trim. In our vision for Hillsborough County, we see a time when we have neighborhoods in which our citizens feel ownership and responsibilities. People know one another and a true sense of community is created. James, I'd like to start with you and get a little bit of background as to what you do at USF. I know we have a Center for Community Design. What does that entail?
The Florida Center for Community Design and Research was started by the state government in 1986 to provide services to local governments, nonprofits, even private sector organizations looking for help in areas of development, urban design, community design, growth management issues, sort of a general catch-all of issues associated with Florida's ongoing development.
So I guess this is somewhat related to our neighborhoods in that you're in the role of giving advice possibly? Or?
Providing technical assistance, giving advice, bringing together groups of experts, some from within USF, some from just within the Florida community at large. And many of the clients have been neighborhoods or city governments looking for advice and assistance with neighborhoods.
Kacy, you're Vice President of the Old Seminole Heights Civic Association. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and your civic association?
Well, we formed in response to a crisis, which is usually how a neighborhood association forms, and I've been Vice President of Old Seminole Heights Neighborhood Association for I'm in my second term now, and we just attempt to try to stay on top of issues and respond to issues or crises that come up.
Thank you. We'd like to go ahead and look at a little tape we have that shows some of the neighborhoods in Tampa and the county and gives us an idea of what we're really talking about when we're talking about neighborhoods. We see some of the older neighborhoods in the city of Tampa and also in the county where the lots are a little bit larger. We certainly have a variety of housing types in Hillsborough County, also mixing with townhouses, older homes, recreational areas, all making up our different neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are kind of the core organizational unit of our city, so it's very important that we look at the problems of neighborhoods. James, kind of going to the problems of neighborhoods, what do you see as one of the biggest obstacles in as far as, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on new neighborhoods with you, to creating viable new neighborhoods in our suburban areas?
Okay. There's a story I heard about 10 years ago. It was actually in a newspaper article where apparently a group of Japanese scientists did some reverse engineering on French wines because they wanted to figure out how to artificially synthesize French wine, and they managed to, in the course of a week or more, once they perfected it, produce fermented grape juice. But there's no way that they could possibly produce anything of the quality of a French wine, which has the history of hundreds of years often of growth and development. And I think the same applies to neighborhoods. I mean, you simply cannot produce one overnight, and it may take you 2 or 3 generations to really get one right. Certainly the economic cycles have something to do with it. You'll have a developer who wants to see a lot of growth, and then it'll be slow because the economy is slowed down or because the marketing's not there. Often commercial development will lag the residential development, so you'll just have a cluster of houses initially. The demands that a commercial developer puts may be different from what were initially envisioned. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into play beyond simply drawing up a plan. And I think it's to the credit of many of our suburban neighborhoods that they're really, maybe many of them are really quite pleasant in that they're only 15 or 20 years old. But it may take another 40 years before they develop that same character of, say, a Hyde Park or parts of Palma Seca or South Tampa, which simply are older. So they've had more cycles. There's been more.
I think that's an interesting point that we often don't consider, that a neighborhood does take time to develop, and you can't always judge the success of a neighborhood when it's only 10 or 15 years old. Kacy, your perspective probably is a little bit different. Coming from Seminole Heights as kind of a neighborhood that's had some rough times in the last 20 years. I think probably with the beginning of building I-275 through it. Tell us some of the problems that you all are trying to overcome in getting Seminole Heights back on its feet.
When Seminole Heights was originally developed, it was developed along the streetcar line, and it had the commercial areas, the service areas that developed along with the neighborhood at the time. And with the interstate being built through the core basically of Seminole Heights, and then the other corridors that serve the outlying areas like Nebraska and Florida and Hillsborough Avenue being widened or improved or one-wayed in some cases. All these things have an effect on the neighborhood, and the commercial districts tend to go away from being services that are something that a neighbor might need or that you might walk down to the corner for, and it becomes older types of zoning for commercial districts allow for things that neighborhoods don't necessarily need anymore. And so we're trying to work on a plan to encourage redevelopment of our neighborhood.
When you talk about Old Seminole Heights, can you give me some idea what the boundaries of that area would be?
Old Seminole Heights has very odd boundaries, but the general area that's called Seminole Heights, it includes 3 neighborhood associations, South and Southeast Seminole Heights, and including Old Seminole Heights, and the boundaries are roughly from Martin Luther King on the south side to along the Hillsborough River on the west and the north sides, and then to either 15th or 22nd Street.
And that takes in most of what you would call Seminole Heights.
Seminole Heights.
Now, was Seminole Heights a separate community at one time, way in the past, or was it always part of the city of Tampa?
I believe it was developed as an extension of the city of Tampa along the streetcar line.
Right. That's something that I think a lot of times we forget, that there was a streetcar in Tampa at one time that influenced our development patterns. James, talking about older neighborhoods with you a little bit, what do you see as some of the obstacles to prevent older parts of the city from redeveloping? What is the common, problem that you see?
There are a number of issues. Some of them are physical issues in the sense that perhaps the infrastructure is not quite as good. Perhaps the streets don't look as nice. Maybe the sidewalks are in sort of disarray. Some of the buildings may not be as well maintained. So your initial premises or your initial opinion, sort of view is this is an old neighborhood. Some of them might be social. There might be a perception that there's crime is an issue. Perception. Maybe it's not the reality, but the perception. Sometimes there's a sense, well, it's too close to the railroad tracks, or it's too close to the downtown, or it's too close to something that people don't want to be near. Some of it is economic. You have neighborhoods that go through periods of rise and decline, and it may be that there is a small commercial area that's not really very viable, but it's still ticking along, and people look at that and they say, well, there's nothing there that I want. I'd really rather live close to a new shopping center. All of these issues have their own life cycles, and you can't all coordinate them. So maybe you can improve the way the neighborhood looks, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the commercial center will come back in the same form. So it's really a sort of a 3-ring circus that you keep sort of juggling over time.
So I guess you have to look at a neighborhood in a very comprehensive way, and solving one problem won't necessarily solve others.
Solving one problem can often create other problems that you don't realize. I mean, it's a little bit like that Hydra head myth, where for every one you kill, 2 more spring up. And really the only way you can I think begin to address them is comprehensively, and often that entails looking outside the boundaries of the neighborhood itself. Factors around it, other neighborhoods, or things like highways or other resources like the river or things like that.
Which I guess have an effect on the health of the neighborhood, what's going on really,
very
even
much
outside
so.
of the boundaries.
Very much so.
I think an example of that might be in Seminole Heights, where you had a major state road cutting through really the center of your neighborhood, which is Hillsborough Avenue. And I know your group was actively involved in dealing with the issue of widening Hillsborough. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you had to deal with?
It was quite a learning experience for everyone involved, and we were at it for many, many years from the beginning. In 1988, when the first public information meeting was held for the PD&E, and then the project itself would go through cycles of where maybe it would be put on hold and the neighborhood might relax a little bit, but there was so much activity associated with trying to figure out how to mitigate the impacts to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood learning how to deal with the various government agencies involved, the City of Tampa, the MPO, the DOT, and to effectively, cause changes to happen to the plan. And all in all, I think it will end up being a contributing amenity to the neighborhood with the greenway and the improvements to the road, including the widening and actually literally the newness of the project.
Can you tell us a little bit, I know you mentioned the greenway, just describe some of the changes that were made to Hillsborough because of your civic association's involvement?
Well, initially the plan called for a very wide section of road on the west side of Florida Avenue, and then there were no plans to continue the roadway on through the historic district from Florida to, say, the interstate. And the plans called for striping out of pavement that wouldn't be used. Well, in our discussions with the DOT, they agreed to eliminate some lanes and eliminate some of that pavement, which allowed for more green space on the north side of the road. And they've had a landscape architect design and are working on the bicycle path, and they've installed a wall, and it will be a nicely planted area on the north side of the roadway there.
Well, that's great. It sounds like that your organization affected some good changes to the roadway design. Has that been the major issue for Seminole Heights, or has there been any smaller issues
Oh,
also?
there are lots of other issues. The neighborhood association worked towards and had implemented the historic district. We are a National Register Historic District, and we have a local district designation. And we're currently working on a serious beautification project that involves the overpasses through the neighborhood. There are 7 overpasses that from underneath the interstate that are gray and dirty, but there are connections to the other half of our neighborhood association, and our beautification projects right now are focusing on those overpasses, and we'd like to see murals painted and involve the community in the painting of these murals.
Great. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of things going on. When we return, we'll talk some more with James Moore and Kacy Curry. Thank you. Welcome back to Beyond Today. I'm your host, Ray Shermonti, and we've been discussing how to recreate thriving neighborhoods. I'm here again with James Moore of the University of South Florida and Kacy Curry, a Seminole Heights resident. James, I wanted to talk a little bit about a new movement in planning, which I'm sure some of our viewing audience might not be aware of, and I guess it's referred to as the new urbanism or neo-traditionalism. Can you tell us about this movement and its origins and where we're going?
Yeah, it's the new urbanism is generally what's accepted as the title for it, and it sort of had two starting points, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and actually on the East Coast it started with a couple out of Miami, Andre Stwani and his wife Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, who hooked up with the developer Robert Davis and produced a plan for the town of Seaside. And basically they spent quite a bit of time before they did the plan looking at other southern towns. And this is a town on the Panhandle, and it's not very close to too much. So they drove around through the South, through Alabama and Georgia and parts of Florida, and they looked for patterns of what they saw there. And these are typically towns that were developed before the Second World War. Many of them were developed in the 19th century. And from their studies they came up with essentially a set of patterns for what they felt made these towns work, and they attempted to duplicate that in the town of Seaside. and were extremely successful with that community. On the West Coast, a man named Peter Calthorpe had been involved in what was called sustainable development in the 1980s, and from that he got interested in the use of transit lines, the reuse of transit lines, and that drew him to a model which is very similar to the streetcar suburbs that were found in the northeast part of the United States, where you had a town center with a train station and some commercial, and then a small area of residential development around that. And that's sort of the paradigm that he's using in California.
And that was pretty much the origin of this whole movement.
To some degree, I think the success of Seaside, as primarily as a sort of vacation, second home, resort development rather than a true town, I think it's surprised quite a few people. I mean, it was on the cover of Newsweek and Time. But it also, I think, is indicative that many of the ideas and aspects that the new urbanists have been talking about have struck a chord with a lot of people in this country.
Right. Kacy, I guess when we're talking about this whole idea of neo-traditionalism, Seminole Heights is probably somewhat of a model for that from the past.
Sure.
I guess in the words of a resident, I'd like to know, what are the things that attract you to an area like Seminole Heights versus a more typical Florida suburb?
One of the main things is its proximity to, say, downtown or in anything in any direction, basically. Another thing, too, is the more appealing architecture. What I conceive of as the more appealing architecture, things that, houses that feel good, houses that feel right, the established streets with the established trees, and the smaller streets, and not having to get on a road or battle traffic to get there. And Seminole Heights has gone through all the phases from having the services and goods that we need through the decay, and now we're just working to get back to that whole neighborhood state.
James mentioned that a lot of the towns that were studied for this whole new urbanist movement were done before World War II. What is generally the time frame of Seminole Heights' original development?
The houses in the historic district are typically from the teens and the 20s, and then the outlying areas of the historic district go on through serious development in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So you've got the whole range, and then there's still infill housing happening.
But it seems like pretty much it follows the premise of being built prior to World War II.
Oh, definitely, most definitely.
James, World War II seems to be a big crack in this whole history of planning. What do you see that happened at that point in time? I know I have my own ideas, but
I think there's a series of factors. We have to remember that the Depression started essentially at the beginning of the 30s, and so you had a period of sort of economic deprivation coupled with a rather extensive decline in development. There were the government projects, but not a lot of private sector projects. And then you had about a 5-year period during the war from about 1940 to 1945. So ostensibly you had a 15-year period where many of the older neighborhoods saw very little happen to them. You had the return of the veterans from the war, and a government that was very eager to reward them, was very eager to get the economy back going. And you had the maturation of the automobile industry in this country during the period of the 30s and the 40s. So after the war, people wanted new things. They wanted to move out to the suburbs. The ability to get a mortgage for almost nothing down and a very low payment made it desirable to buy a single-family house. People like Levitt on the East Coast and Joseph Eichler on the West Coast perfected this sort of mass production of housing. And so you had a sort of national sensibility that looked away from what was old, away from what had preceded, towards the suburbs, towards modernization, as it were. And it was a culture that was, for the first time, firmly based on the automobile, as opposed to any other form of mobility. And the automobile promotes dispersal. It promotes a sort of less dense. And because a typical pre-war development took a long time to develop, there was a sort of maturation process. Here you had literally people boasting about how many hundreds of houses they could build in a month and could occupy, and it happened so quickly that a lot of the sensibilities of a pre-war development were lost. The sort of radical use of zoning came on after the war as well, with sort of the idea that you would separate uses. You'd separate commercial uses from residential uses. You'd separate industrial uses from, say, retail type uses. And the automobile made it easy to tie them all back together. So the sensibility that gestated in a 1920s or a 19-teens town was actually outlawed in many ways through the the use of zoning after the war.
Kacy, we see somewhat of a return to some of the neighborhoods within the city of Tampa and probably other cities across the country. What do you see is happening, I guess? You mentioned some of the positive things, but the people that are making the choices to come back, what's causing them to want to do that? Is it just proximity to downtown, or is there more, really, that's driving their choices to fix an old house up in an inner city neighborhood?
Gosh, that's a hard question, and very, I guess, taken on a personal basis by anyone who chooses to look at those areas. But I think that proximity has a lot to do with it, and the ease of getting around in an urban area, and also the quality of the housing stock would have a lot to do with it too. And then too, you go through your cycles of your land and real estate values, and at some point it becomes seemingly considerably more affordable to move back into an urban area and spend the time or the money doing some restoration, say.
James, kind of going back to these new communities, we touched a little bit on this new urbanism, and you talked about the history of it, but can you describe a little bit of what it is and how the car is incorporated into this new movement?
Right. To some degree, it's an attempt to draw the best aspects out of these pre-war, or these even pre-20th century models. Most of the new urbanist communities are built around a central focus, which would be what they call the town center, which would involve some commercial uses, often mixed with maybe residential uses or office uses. There's a harkening back to sort of the City Beautiful movement, where you placed civic buildings in honorific positions. You had things like a village green or a town park. The use of even things like sculpture and fountains, sort of public ornamentation to create a sense of here is a special place. In terms of dealing with the car, they have gone back to the use of a gridiron or a network of streets as opposed to a cul-de-sac sort of hierarchical system. And they've promoted things like on-street parking. They've promoted the use of alleyways for parking in behind houses as opposed to in front of houses. I don't think they've attempted to radically move people away from using their cars so much as providing designs that allow you the opportunity not to use it. It's certainly a tenet of any new urbanist project that you can walk somewhere, and it's an interesting walk, whether it's to a park or to a recreational amenity or to the school or even to the town center. And certainly I don't think anyone believes that you'll spend all of your time just walking around in your neighborhood, but the opportunity is there. And I think it's really an attempt to provide alternatives to people who are willing to live that way.
In your experience with students coming into your program at the University of South Florida, are they receptive to these ideas, or how do they feel about this return to the past?
I think it probably varies. It varies. Certainly the ones that are more well-traveled have seen alternatives. I mean, these are familiar to people who've been in the Northeast or certainly have been to Europe and have looked around. I think they understand that there's a logic to them. Certainly when you explain it in terms of providing alternatives, providing options. I think it's really part of the educational process. I also think that most students are willing to suspend their disbelief a little bit in the sense that they're learning something new, they're learning something different. And I think that in many ways, there's an innate charm to certainly some of the older neighborhoods and to some of the design ideas in these new urbanist plans that's hard to avoid. I mean, it is innately nicer to walk to a town center than to walk to some strip center on a 6-lane arterial road. And we try to, I think, educate them as to some of the economic implications of these, and that it may cost a little bit more to do a new urbanist design, or it may have some implications that are different from, say, a standard suburban development.
Do you have any figures on what the percentage of extra cost is, or has any research been done along those lines?
I personally don't have any figures, and I suspect that the research has been done is simply one project compared to, say, a standard project of another size. Many of the more highly touted new urbanist projects tend to be towards the upper end, which some critics use as a way of sort of downplaying their validity. In reality, what it means is that they have an audience that will provide them with the resources to do it right the first time, and that maybe you'll see more moderate scaled projects being done in the future.
Often new ideas do tend to come from the upper end of the market, though, isn't that correct?
Because it's the audience you need that's willing to provide you the resources to really try out a new idea. Yeah, absolutely.
Kacy, I wanted to ask you a question again from your citizen perspective, and we haven't discussed much of government's role in helping or hurting neighborhoods, but what can government do really to help some of the city's neighborhoods revitalize, and what shouldn't they do?
Well, I think the neighborhood plans that the city of Tampa has already got in place, and then, or the element of the comprehensive plan, and the one that the county is working on are all good ideas. The neighborhoods in the city of Tampa, some of them, as in our case, are already working on their own plan. I think that we'll see many of them will be very similar to each other when the plans are developed. They're very quite time consuming, and the city could help with the development of the plans. They could also listen to but generally the theme of what the neighborhood associations are saying or trying to say to the city government as far as what we'd like for resources and improvements.
So really the most important thing government can do then is to really listen to what the citizens are saying and try to be supportive of that.
Yes,
great.
The themes are very similar.
Well, I'd like to thank today's guests for talking with us about our future and about preserving our neighborhoods, both new and existing neighborhoods, and thank you for tuning in. Next month we will talk about providing excellence in education. I'm Ray Charmonti, and on behalf of the Planning Commission, I thank you for thinking beyond today.